Hi, I'm John Deere, owner of Adorable Ideas, and I'd like to share with you the history of digitizing. Back in the early 50s, my grandparents immigrated to Canada and started a Shifley embroidery company. They started humbly with one manual pantograph loom, and this loom was so old that it didn't even run jacquard paper tape. The puncher, or digitizer as they're now known, sat at the end of the 10-yard loom and moved the entire loom live with the pantograph. There was no margin for error, and every row of embroidery had to be done manually, one stitch at a time. One mistake and you potentially ruined hundreds of emblems. I was very fortunate in that I was trained by Shifley masters for the first 2 years of my career, and I learned how to manually punch one stitch at a time. Digitizing was more of an art that required you to implement more theory in those days. Embroiderers now run one design at a time on a nice little hoop. In those days, you had between 10 to 15 yards of fabric spanned across a loom, with thousands of emblems or embroidered elements being done all at once. There was no quick color changes, no automatic trimmers. Everything had to be planned and executed perfectly. On these early machines, you had no undo buttons, no second chance. A true Shifley puncher apprenticed for over a decade to be considered a Shifley master. The process of digitizing started long before you actually punched the design. You would first take the original artwork into a darkroom with an overhead camera, and you'd blow up the image onto a table exactly 6 times larger than the original size of the design, because the Shifleys were calibrated to a 6:1 scale. After you drew the design using old-school drafting equipment, it then went to the stitcher. Now the stitcher's job was to use these tools that look like pattern wheels with different spaces on the wheel. You'd measure the width of the stitch and choose the appropriate wheel, and you'd run it across the paper draft. This would put little penetrations in the paper, and then you'd then take a pencil and a ruler and you'd literally draw in every second stitch of the design. Now keep in mind, if a design had 10,000 stitches, you actually had to draw 5,000 lines. After the draft was drawn and stitched in, the puncher would tack it onto the pantograph board and literally punch every single stitch. A lot of people think that it was called punching because of the holes punched into paper tape, but that wasn't the reason. The puncher would push the point of the pantograph into the paper draft, leaving a mark. Why? Because it was the only way to work without getting lost in the design. It showed you where you had already been. The Shifley machines evolved to include what was called automats. You could now punch paper tape that had all the commands of the machine, including the X and Y movements. Pins in the automat would tell the machine where to move and what to do. Needles in or out, slow speed or fast speed, borers in or out, all written into the paper tape. This was revolutionary, as you can now do multiple runs without having to manually repunch the design. You just had to rewind the tape. You could also edit designs. You just had to learn how to read paper tape, repunch the section, and then cut and splice. I remember unrolling hundreds of feet of paper tape when I had to edit a design. Now very quickly, technology took hold and things dramatically changed. The first was the introduction of the Digitrax, and this was a dream come true. You no longer had to digitize every single stitch. You could put marks to define objects and marks to define curves, and it would automatically fill in objects with stitches. It was considered a miracle. These Digitrax spat out smaller 8-channel tape, which we would then convert to the jacquard tape for the Shifley machines. Editing still required learning to read paper tape, but we were now well on our way. And then came the age of computers, and things were then never the same. I remember back in the DOS days seeing stitches appear on a computer screen, and I got to admit that was a miracle because we were digitizing blindly before that. We never actually saw our designs until they stitched out on the machine. Now I have to be honest, I was a board-based digitizer even up to 15 years ago, and the reason was simple. It was speed. When you digitized on a board, and if you were accurate, you could digitize as fast as your hands could move and your mind could think. When I picked up a mouse, it was like trying to do fine art with a brick in my hand. It just slowed me down drastically. And then the answer came when PC pen tablet technology became available, and we finally gave up our boards forever. Currently I digitize with a pen directly on my screen. And this is the best way to go, but it can be a little more costly. As a second choice, you can pick up a pen tablet at a very reasonable price. It does take a little bit of hand-eye coordination to get used to, but it's still much friendlier than a mouse. Now, the one thing that I want you to remember is that the art of digitizing has been around for over 130 years. As much as I love technology for the ease of use and the speed that it provides, it's actually the foundation of my past that goes into every design that I do and every lesson that I teach. And I think this foundation can be your success as much as it has been mine.